Rain drummed steadily against the rusted tin roof as Mason Vance looked out at the wide stretch of farmland he had called home his entire life. The morning light was pale yellow beneath a thick blanket of gray clouds, painting the fields in watercolors. Rows of crops, neatly tucked into the earth, seemed to shimmer under the drizzle. Mason's feet were bare, showing the calluses and roughness that came from countless hours shoveling, raking, and trudging through the fields. He inhaled the scent of damp soil, reminding him of long ago childhood days, when his father and grandfather had guided him across these very plots. Even now, after so many years, he could feel the same deep contentment in its smell. The farm was more than a job. It was a legacy, passed down through generations. He loved this land, every inch of it. But that morning, his usually steady heart felt pinched by worry. On the horizon lay a white SUV, kicking up puddles as it turned up the narrow dirt laneway. Through droplets running down the windshield of his old truck, Mason could see how out of place this pristine vehicle looked in the farm's muddy surroundings. Months ago, he had received notice that a larger commercial enterprise claimed part of his property line as theirs by right of an old boundary agreement. Mason had tried to reason with them at first, hoping to settle matters amicably, but corporate attorneys had sent official letters, and now a hearing was scheduled to determine the rightful ownership of the farmland. The SUV's arrival this morning was just another step in that aggravating process. From the SUV emerged a figure in a crisp charcoal gray suit. Caroline Pearson was every inch the polished lawyer. Slender heels, neatly pinned hair, and an air of unflappable confidence. She seemed built for the bright, modern corridors of city law firms, and not at all for the mud or whirring insects of rural farmland. Yet she stood at attention, surveying the property. Mason guessed she was scouring every detail for evidence she could use against him. A fierce determination settled over him. This was his family's farm, and he couldn't imagine giving up even a foot of it. Even so, his curiosity was piqued by the attorney's presence. She didn't stride into the yard with the condescension he half expected. Instead, she advanced carefully, as though measuring each step. Pulling himself from the truck, Mason made his way across the soaked grass, letting his toes slip beneath the soft mud. Raindrops pelted his wide-brimmed hat. Caroline, standing with her sleek black umbrella, regarded him for an instant. Sandwiched between them was a silent tension, he representing decades of sweat and dirt, she representing an unfamiliar world of legal jargon and tidy deals. "Good morning," she said, her voice just loud enough to cut through the rain. Mason answered with a short nod. "I'm here on behalf of Argus Development," Caroline continued. "My name is Caroline Pearson. We hope to be able to finalize some details around the land dispute before the upcoming hearing." Her words were carefully measured, neither aggressive nor friendly, though Mason detected a slight hesitation. He cleared his throat, conscious of his bare feet in contrast to her polished heels. "Mason Vance," he introduced himself. "This is my land, or so my father and grandfather always told me. I'm not in the business of giving it up to a corporation. You can look around, gather your notes, but I'll warn you, I'm not going down without a fight." Caroline nodded politely. The drizzle caught the edges of her umbrella, sending a slight mist over her shoulders. "I understand," she said. "However, the law is fairly explicit about the boundary lines established according to old surveys." A slight apologetic smile flickered on her lips. "If the company can prove otherwise, I'm obligated to represent their claim." Mason felt a flash of anger, but also an inexplicable pang of empathy for the woman who had to be the corporate messenger. Something in her hazel eyes didn't match the coldness he had anticipated. "You do your job, Miss Pearson," he muttered, "and I'll do mine." He turned away, guiding her toward the portion of the fields in dispute. She managed the muddy ground in her heels surprisingly well, stepping carefully around puddles. Her professionalism struck Mason as admirable, even if she was, from his point of view, an adversary. They walked along a fence line where the old posts leaned wearily, half sunk into the ground. Tall grass bordered the path, and dandelions with their bright heads dotted the sodden, lush growth. Mason looked at Caroline, waiting for a scornful or dismissive remark about the fence's poor state. Instead, she set down her leather portfolio on a drier portion of grass and began measuring distances, comparing them with a worn map. Mason noticed her biting her lower lip, a sign that perhaps she was more anxious than her polished exterior suggested. He surveyed her with curiosity. "You're not from around here, I take it," he said, making conversation while she took notes. Caroline gave a low laugh, glancing up. Rain trickled off her umbrella in a delicate curtain. "No, I grew up in Oak Ridge, the city 15 miles south of here," she said. "My grandparents owned a house with a little orchard, but nothing quite like this farmland." She hesitated. "I had an uncle who ran a small produce stand in the summers. I suppose that's the closest connection I have to rural life." Something about the way she said it caused Mason to pause. He wondered if there was more behind her uncle's orchard story. Perhaps a childhood memory that resonated with her as strongly as the farmland did with him, but she turned back to her measuring tape, letting the moment pass. Days blended together as they prepared for the approaching hearing, which was now only a few weeks away. Mason spent his time harvesting, maintaining fences, and searching for any documents his ancestors might have left behind to support his claim. At the same time, Caroline arrived periodically to compare maps and talk to local surveyors. Although the tension in the air persisted, they found subtle moments of cordiality. One day, Mason offered her a freshly picked peach from his orchard. She accepted with a small smile, then surprised him by taking off her heels and tiptoeing barefoot through the wet grass. She dusted off her feet quickly to remain professional, but he never forgot the image of her momentary abandoned heels dangling from one hand, the peach juice running down her wrist. Their conversations, at first strictly business, began to wander into safer territories. Mason found out that Caroline actually liked being outside, even if her job mostly confined her to boardrooms. In the evenings, after a particularly long day of surveying, they shared quiet teas in Mason's old farmhouse kitchen, discussing everything from local wildlife to the legal complexities of farmland inheritance. They still remained on opposite sides, legally speaking, but there was a growing sense of camaraderie or something deeper just beneath the surface. In busier hours, Caroline would vanish back to the city, her figure lost in the swirl of big buildings and corporate demands. Mason could almost sense the difference in her posture when she had to speak like a lawyer for Argus development, crisp syllables falling from her lips. She looked tired during those times, though she tried to hide it. Meanwhile, Mason kept working the fields, unsure of how the hearing would pan out, unwilling to lose hope. One late afternoon, Caroline arrived covered in an anxious energy. She passed Mason a stack of legal documents and asked if he had any personal records that could challenge Argus's historical claims. Mason's face fell. He'd spent days combing through old boxes in the attic, finding precious family photographs, diaries, and all kinds of mementos, but nothing that bore official stamps or carried legal weight. Caroline seemed genuinely concerned, as though she realized how much held significance for Mason. "I'll go over everything anyway," she offered gently. "Sometimes a single line in a family ledger can disprove the official story." She followed him up the narrow staircase to the farmhouse attic. Dust motes caught the light as they sifted through old trunks and crates. Mason pointed out the large wooden chests that had belonged to his grandfather. His grandfather's handwriting appeared on old notebooks, notes on the weather, crop yields, and the occasional jotted expense. Caroline scanned each loosely bound notebook, her expression intent but also surprisingly tender. She asked about the lines scrawled in the margins, the small details that Mason's grandfather seemed to treasure. Mason found himself explaining the cyclical nature of farm life, that every year had a different personality shaped by rainfall and sunshine. He talked about how his family used to celebrate planting seasons through songs and gatherings. Caroline listened intently, seeming to connect with the stories in a way that transcended her role as a lawyer. Eventually, she paused at a dog-eared page. "Look here," she said, voice hushed with excitement. She pointed to a small note referencing a boundary walk that took place some 70 years prior. Mason leaned closer, and his heart skipped a beat as he read words describing how the farmland's property lines were defined by a certain oak tree. If it still stood, it could be physical proof of the actual boundary. Their eyes met, both of them momentarily thrilled by the discovery. Caroline smiled broadly, unconsciously reaching out to clasp Mason's arm in her excitement. When they both realized the intimacy, she withdrew, clearing her throat with a slight blush. "You should show this to the county surveyor," she said, regaining her composure. "If that old oak is still there, it might change things." Mason tried to keep his voice steady. "I will," he affirmed. After a pause, he added, "Thank you." In the days that followed, Mason took the old county surveyor to the site indicated in his grandfather's notes. The ancient oak tree still stood, gnarled and proud, at the far north corner of the property. Its thick trunk twisted upward, massive limbs spreading overhead like an umbrella. Moss covered parts of its bark, but it was undeniably the same oak described in the journal entry. Mason felt a rush of gratitude for his ancestors, who had carefully documented their boundaries, and perhaps for Caroline, who had taken the time to look so closely. As the hearing approached, tension pressed down on Mason. If Argus Development wanted to push forward with their claim, they'd do so aggressively and possibly dispute the oak tree's significance. Caroline, however, remained easy to talk to, even encouraging him the night before the court date. Meetings had softened from purely adversarial standoffs into an unexpected friendship that crackled with possibility. She shared a story about visiting her uncle's orchard as a child. The orchard had been under threat of foreclosure once, and she recalled her uncle's tense stand against city lenders. That memory, she confided, was one of the reasons she had gone into law to help families in crisis. Hearing that stunned Mason, who realized she wasn't just standing on the opposite side out of cold ambition. There was a genuine depth to her, a longing to reconcile law and empathy. On the morning of the hearing, they found themselves outside the old county courthouse. The sky was clear and bright, as though the storm clouds that had followed them for weeks had finally exhausted themselves. Mason wore his best boots and a clean shirt, feeling slightly uncomfortable in formal clothes. Caroline, meanwhile, looked perfectly at ease in a tailored navy suit, her hair smoothed into a neat style. If not for the swirl of attorneys and county officials milling about, Mason might have taken a moment to tell her how beautiful she looked. But the seriousness of the day pressed on them. Inside, the hearing room's fluorescent lights gave everyone a washed-out complexion. Mason's knuckles turned white as he gripped the folder containing his grandfather's journal. Across the room, Argus Development had assembled a small legal team. None of them seemed to notice Caroline's presence, or they accepted it without question, for she was their representative. The judge arrived and formalities began. Mason, heart pounding, witnessed the clash of documents and laws. Then the moment arrived when Caroline stood on behalf of Argus. Mason braced himself for a carefully crafted argument that would unravel his family's claim. But instead, Caroline presented the newly unearthed evidence to the court with professional clarity, explaining how the original property boundary had been verbally outlined and documented decades before. She did not conceal the significance of the oak tree. In fact, her tone, though measured, was strangely protective of the truth. Mason couldn't fully comprehend what was happening as she laid out details that supported his argument, not Argus's. He saw subtle scowls ripple across the opposing counsel's faces. When her explanation concluded, there was a stunned silence. Mason stared, astonished that the corporate lawyer was essentially undermining her client's claim. The judge frowned, pointed to Argus's lead attorney, and asked if the company wished to challenge the authenticity of the evidence. Finding themselves cornered by the historical record and the existence of the oak, Argus's legal team requested a brief recess. During that pause, Caroline walked over to Mason, ignoring the eyes that followed her. "You," he began, searching for words that wouldn't betray the roiling emotions in his chest. "Miss Pearson, you just—" Caroline raised a hand, hushed in her voice. I am obligated to represent Argus' legal claim, but I'm also obligated to present all relevant evidence. This, she tapped his grandfather's journal, is relevant. I'm performing my duty to the fullest extent. Mason exhaled slowly. He wanted to thank her, to express how deeply her integrity touched him. But the swirl of court business resumed before he could speak further. After a rattling half hour of hushed negotiations and clarifications, the judge delivered a ruling. The farmland's boundary lines, including that contested corner, properly belonged to Mason Vance, just as his grandfather's notes had said. The snap of the gavel sealed this official acknowledgement. A wave of relief washed over Mason, who might have slumped to his knees if not for his pride. The Argus attorneys left quickly, refusing to even look Caroline in the eye. He could imagine the consequences she might face for not pushing Argus's case more assertively. Yet, she didn't seem regretful. Instead, she stepped from behind the table as the spectators filtered out of the courtroom. He found her alone in the corridor outside, twisting her hands together in uncharacteristic anxiety. When she saw him, she tried for a smile, but appeared uncertain. I imagine Argus is going to let me go, she said quietly, reading the question in his gaze. I didn't destroy your evidence, which is basically what they would have wanted me to do. Strictly speaking, I followed the law. I just didn't twist it in their favor. Mason took a hesitant step closer. The corridor was nearly empty, except for a court clerk lingering at the far end. I owe you a great deal, he said. Not just for the land, but for being honest, for caring. Caroline's lips twisted in an attempt at a wry laugh. I don't know if caring is something lawyers are known for, she replied, but I suppose after seeing what this farm means to you, and remembering what my uncle's orchard meant to my family, it felt right to do. Mason blinked back the moisture in his eyes. He noticed a strand of her hair had slipped free from its perfect arrangement. Gently, he reached out to tuck it behind her ear, pausing to see if she would allow the gesture. Their eyes locked, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. Caroline let herself lean in, just a fraction. In that quiet heartbeat, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. Come by the farm sometime, he said, his voice low and rich with invitation. Just to see how everything turned out. Her eyes softened. I'm guessing I might be free for a while, she joked, though her smile was shadowed by the uncertainty of her future. But yes, I'd like that, Mason. I would. When Caroline came by the next week, the sky was bright with early morning sunlight. She arrived in jeans and flats, a simple white blouse, no more suits, no more heels. Mason met her with a grin, noticing how her posture had shifted from rigid professionalism to a more relaxed ease. They walked the length of the farmland side by side, sometimes shoulders brushing. She admired how green and vibrant the universe of crops looked under the new day, and he admired how the once intimidating lawyer seemed at home among the rows of plants. They paused under that old oak tree, its broad trunk dividing the farmland from the neighboring slope. Caroline touched the bark. Strange to think that a single tree decided the outcome, she mused. Mason picked a blade of grass and chewed on its end thoughtfully. Sometimes it's the little things in life that can shift everything, he said. A note in a journal, a memory of an orchard, a chance encounter. She tilted her head, a gentle smile dancing across her lips. Now that I'm free from Argus. Free is good, Mason interrupted, stepping closer. You can do whatever you want, Caroline nodded, a soft breeze loosening a strand of hair. I want to figure out how to use the law in a way that helps people like you. Maybe I can represent folks who can't afford fancy lawyers. Stand up for small farms. All because of this place, your fight. It reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place. He felt a flicker of delight in his chest. If you ever want to use the farmhouse as an office, he joked, I'm sure we can fix you up a space, as long as you still walk the fields barefoot sometimes. Her cheeks warmed at the casual mention of barefoot adventures. She nodded. I might take you up on that, though I might need a pair of good boots. Mason laughed, the sound echoing through the orchard. It was strange to feel such a buoyant happiness so soon after weeks of stress. But here with Caroline, it felt like the new normal, a sense that battles, while painful, could lead to new beginnings. They ambled together toward the orchard, where Mason carefully selected a cluster of cherries and handed them to Caroline. "Taste these," he said, watching as she tossed one into her mouth. A satisfied hum escaped her lips. "Sweet," she commented, juices running down her fingers. "Everything here is so alive." Mason took her sticky hand in his own, calloused one, leading her to a lower branch heavy with fruit. "That's how I feel," he said quietly. "Alive." He hesitated, then met her gaze directly. "The day I saw you in your suit, with your perfect posture and your legal talk, I was sure you wouldn't understand a thing about the life out here. Turns out I was wrong." Caroline squeezed his hand. "I have roots out here too," she said. "I just needed reminding." Their slow walk continued, winding through rows of vegetables and arcs of orchard trees. The sun grew warmer, lighting the back of Caroline's hair like strands of gold. They spoke of the future, Mason's plans to expand the orchard, Caroline's hopes of establishing a small firm dedicated to land rights cases. Each seemed more vibrant in the presence of the other, as though they'd discovered something precious that they couldn't bear to let go. When the sun dipped low, they ended up seated on the farmhouse porch, a classic swing rocking beneath them. Mason poured sweet tea into a pair of mason jars. Crickets began their evening chorus, and the sky glowed with the oranges and pinks of twilight. Little by little, conversation gave way to comfortable silence, the shared contentment of a day spent in companionship, mutual respect, and a hint of blooming love. Caroline's gaze swept across the fields, now tinted a dusky purple by the fading light. "I keep thinking how close we came to never talking," she said softly. "One word from the judge in Argus's favor, and that might have been it. I would have walked away, never really knowing you, never hearing about your grandfather or how your father taught you to plant seeds in spring. That would have been such a loss." Mason took another sip of tea, letting the sweet, cool liquid roll over his tongue. "Sometimes the best things happen when we dare to look beyond the surface," he replied. He set his jar down and turned to face her fully. The shadow of the overhead porch light sharpened the angles of her face, emphasizing the tenderness in her eyes. "I was so closed off at first. You were just the lawyer to me. Yet, here we are." She nodded, her eyes drifting to follow the final glow of the sun. The hush in the air felt expectant. Without further prompting, she leaned into Mason, resting her head on his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, his palm coming to rest lightly against the soft fabric of her blouse. She sighed contentedly, and they watched the horizon slowly lose its color. "I wish I could have met your grandfather," she said after a pause. Sounds like a wonderful man. The kind whose dedication to this land and careful record keeping saved it all these years later." Mason rumbled a soft laugh. "He was a pain in the neck, too," he teased. "Stubborn as an ox, convinced that nobody could love the farm as much as he did." He paused a beat, "But I think he'd be happy to see me sitting here with you, particularly after the new boundary lines are established and the legal dust has settled. Perhaps he'd be proud that we found a way to keep the spirit of this place alive." Caroline closed her eyes, letting her mind trace the images Mason's stories had created. Winter nights, watching storms roll in, spring mornings planting seeds, summer days in the orchard, and autumn harvests that bustled with neighborly cheer. "I can see it all so vividly," she murmured. "Maybe, if you'll have me, I could help you keep that spirit burning bright." He didn't reply right away, but gripped her shoulder gently. There was no question in either of their minds that they no longer occupied separate worlds. They had discovered a common bond, as natural as the changing seasons. Crickets carried on their melody as the moon rose overhead, silvering the farmland below. Fireflies blinked in and out of the tall grass, shimmering beacons that transformed the fields into a fairy tale landscape. The serenade of rural nightlife enveloped them, each sound amplifying the harmony they now felt with each other. Caroline lifted her head, looking up at him. She smiled, recalling how she'd first seen him, standing in the muddy field, barefoot, unsmiling, ready for a fight. Now his face was gentle, the corners of his eyes creasing and warm. Something in her chest fluttered, and she tilted her chin just enough. Mason leaned in, his lips gently meeting hers, a soft, tentative kiss beneath the porch light. Their shared breath was filled with the lingering flavors of the orchard and sweet tea, a moment so simple yet monumental in its significance. When they parted, the look they exchanged was filled with an unspoken promise. Here was a chance to build something real, grounded in measured trust and open heart. The night swelled around them, full of possibilities. Quietly, Mason reached for her hand, the calluses on his palms brushing against her smooth skin. She didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, she curled her fingers through his. There, on that farmhouse porch, they listened to the soft hum of insects and let their hearts settle into a kind of peace. They didn't need a verdict or a contract for what they felt. The farmland had been saved, and with it, something else took root, a new beginning, nurtured by the promise of the land and the found understanding between a barefoot farmer and a polished lawyer, each discovering their mutual roots that went deeper than they ever dared to dream.